There were jobs in Canada where you could support a family of four, own a house, and retire with a pension doing work that literally doesn't exist anymore. Not downsized, not automated, completely gone. Your grandfather had a career that you couldn't do today even if you wanted to because the entire profession vanished. These are 15 Canadian jobs that paid middle-class wages from the 1950s through 1970s that have been completely erased from the economy. Some disappeared because of technology, some because industries collapsed, some because the things Canadians needed in 1960 aren't things anyone needs in 2025. 1. Iceman delivering to every house 6 days a week before refrigerators became standard in Canadian homes in the 1950s. Policemen delivered blocks of ice to keep food cold. They'd show up at dawn with horse-drawn wagons later replaced by trucks, carrying 25 to 50-pound ice blocks with giant tongs, hauling them up flights of stairs to deliver to ice boxes in every apartment and house. This was a full-time unionized job that paid $65 a week in 1950. That's equivalent to about $800 weekly today. You could support a family delivering ice. The job required physical strength and reliability, but no education beyond elementary school. Show up 6 days a week, deliver ice to your route, collect payments, go home. But here's what killed it. Electric refrigerators became affordable. By 1955, 80% of Canadian homes had refrigerators. Elevators in Canadian office buildings and department stores required operators. These weren't automated systems. Someone sat on a stool, controlled the elevator manually, announced floors, and made sure passengers got on and off safely. Every multi-story building in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver employed elevator operators. This was considered a decent service job. Elevator operators at major department stores like Eaton's and Simpson's made $55 to $70 per week in the 1960s. They got benefits, pensions, and respect, reliability, and the ability to operate mechanical controls, but it was accessible to anyone. Automatic elevators killed the profession completely. Push-button elevators became standard in new construction in the 1960s. Older buildings retrofitted. By 1975, elevator operators were gone except in luxury hotels that kept them for ambiance. An occupation that employed thousands of Canadians disappeared because pushing a button yourself was more efficient than paying someone to push it for you. The last unionized elevator operators in Toronto worked until 1979. They fought automation through their union, but eventually lost. You can't negotiate with technology that makes your job unnecessary. The operators who remained were ceremonial positions in high-end hotels, not actual transportation workers. 3. Telephone switchboard operator connecting every call before. Direct dial phones became universal in the 1960s. Placing a phone call required an operator. Told the operator what number you wanted, and they physically connected your call by plugging cables into a switchboard. This was how all phone calls worked. Long distance required multiple operators in different cities manually routing your call. Bell Canada employed over 12,000 operators in the 1950s. This was one of the largest female-dominated professions in Canada. Women were specifically hired because Bell believed they had better temperaments for customer service. Operators made $45 to $60 per week, which was good money for women at that time when most other options were secretarial or retail work. But here's what's brutal about this one. The operators knew automation was coming. Bell was transparent about developing direct dial technology throughout the 1950s. The women working these jobs watched their profession's death approach slowly over a decade. Direct dialing rolled out city by city across Canada from 1958 to 1975. Each time a city converted, hundreds of operators were laid off. By 1980, there were fewer than 500 operators left in Canada, handling only specialized services. An occupation that employed 12,000 people was reduced to 500 in 20 years. The women who started as operators in 1955 at age 20 were 45 when their jobs disappeared. Many never found equivalent employment again. Milkman delivering fresh milk. Every morning Canadian milkmen delivered fresh milk in glass bottles to doorsteps every morning from the 1920s through the 1970s. They'd arrive before dawn, leave milk in insulated boxes on porches, collect empty bottles, and move to the next house. Most neighborhoods had daily milk delivery routes serviced by local dairies. This was steady work that paid $70 to $80 per week in the 1960s. Milkmen worked for dairy companies that provided trucks, routes, and benefits. It required early mornings and physical endurance, but it was reliable, middle-class employment. Guys did this for 30 years and retired with pensions. Two things killed milk delivery. First, supermarkets started selling milk cheaper than delivery services. Second, refrigerators got better, and Canadians could store more milk, reducing the need for daily delivery. By 1975, most Canadian cities had eliminated milk delivery. By 1985, it was completely gone except for boutique services in wealthy neighborhoods. But here's the math that destroyed them. A milkman could service maybe 80 to 100 houses per morning. A supermarket could sell milk to thousands of families per week with no delivery infrastructure. The economics stopped working. The dairy companies that employed milkmen either went bankrupt or pivoted to wholesale distribution. The milkmen were let go with no comparable jobs available. 5. Railway brakemen, riding the outside of moving trains before automatic braking systems. Canadian freight trains required brakemen who manually set brakes on individual rail cars. They'd climb on top of moving trains, run along the roofs, jumping from car to car, and manually turn brake wheels to slow sections of the train. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in Canada. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific employed over 3,000 brakemen in the 1950s. They made $80 to $100 per week, which was excellent money because the job was so dangerous. Brakemen died regularly, falling from moving trains or getting crushed between cars. But it paid well enough that men took the risk. Automatic air brakes eliminated the entire profession. George Westinghouse invented air brakes in the 1860s, but Canadian railways were slow to adopt them for freight trains. By the 1960s, automation was complete. Brakemen were replaced by systems controlled from the engine. The last brakeman in Canada worked in the early 1970s as the railways phased out manual braking entirely. Here's what's insane. The technology that eliminated railway brakemen existed for 80 years before railways fully implemented it. They kept using brakemen because it was cheaper than upgrading equipment. Once labor costs rose high enough, they automated. The brakemen spent decades doing a job that could have been eliminated before they were born. 6. Telegraph operator transmitting Morse code messages. Telegraph operators transmitted messages in Morse code across Canada through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Canadian Pacific and Canadian National both operated telegraph networks connecting every major town. Operators sat at stations receiving and sending coded messages all day. This required learning Morse code and typing skills, so it was considered semi-skilled work. Operators made $60 to $75 per week in the 1950s. It was indoor work, less physically demanding than manual labor, and had some prestige because it required technical knowledge. Small towns often had one telegraph operator who was an important person in the community handling urgent communications. But telephones and later telex machines destroyed telegraph services. Telegram volume had dropped 70%. By 1972, Canadian Pacific discontinued its telegraph service entirely. The operators were laid off with no transferable skills because Morse code had no other applications. Learning a specialized communication system that became obsolete meant starting over in new careers at 40 or 50 years old. The last commercial telegraph in Canada was sent in 1999 by CN. But the operator jobs were gone 30 years earlier. But the career of telegraph operator died in the early 1970s. 7. Bowling alley pin setter resetting pins by hand before automatic pin setters. Bowling alleys employed teenagers and young men to manually reset pins after every throw. They'd sit behind the lanes, collect knocked-down pins, rearrange them in formation, and return balls through chutes. Every bowling lane needed a pin setter working constantly during business hours. A busy bowling alley in 1950s, Toronto or Montreal might employ 20 pin setters per shift. They made $35 to $50 per week, which was decent money for young guys without education. It was physically demanding and boring, but it was available work that required no skills beyond being able to arrange 10 pins quickly. Automatic pin setters destroyed this job immediately when they were introduced. Brunswick and AMF both developed automatic systems in the late 1940s. By 1960, most Canadian bowling alleys had converted. A machine could do the work of 2 pin setters faster and more accurately. The job disappeared almost overnight. One day you're resetting pins for $45 per week. The next month, the alley installs machines and you're unemployed. But here's the scale of the loss. Bowling was massively popular in the 1950s and 60s. Thousands of young Canadian men worked as pin setters. All of them lost jobs simultaneously across the country. There was no gradual phase-out. Machines replaced humans in months, not years. 8. Film projectionist running movie theater equipment. Movie theaters required skilled projectionists from the 1920s through the 1990s. Timed reel changes perfectly and fixed mechanical problems during shows. Union projectionists in major Canadian cities made good money because the job required technical expertise. Projectionists in Toronto and Montreal made $400 to $500 per week in the 1970s. That's equivalent to $2,500 to $3,000 weekly today. It was a skilled trade with apprenticeships and union protection. Guys made careers as projectionists, working in the same theater for 30 years. But digital projection eliminated the entire profession. Digital files replaced physical film reels in the 2000s. Theaters no longer needed projectionists because digital systems ran automatically. By 2015, almost no theaters employed projections. A career that existed for 80 years disappeared in 1 decade. Here's what made this brutal. The projectionists saw it coming for years as digital projection developed. They knew their jobs were ending, but couldn't do anything about it. The last projectionists worked into their 60s watching their profession die, knowing they'd trained for careers that would be obsolete before they retired. 9. Typesetter arranging metal letters for printing before computer typesetting. Printing newspapers, books, and advertisements required typesetters who manually arranged individual metal letters into words, sentences, and pages. This was highly skilled work requiring years of apprenticeship. Typesetters could read text upside down and backwards because that's how metal type was arranged. Master typesetters in Canada made $500 to $600 per week in the 1970s. This was well-paid skilled labor, comparable to electricians or plumbers. The Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, and Montreal Gazette all employed dozens of typesetters working in shifts to produce daily papers. Computer typesetting destroyed the profession almost overnight. By 1985, almost no newspapers used manual typesetting. The typesetters were laid off en masse. An entire skilled trade that took 5 years to learn became obsolete in less than 10 years. The unions fought hard against automation but lost completely. Typesetter unions tried to negotiate protection, force newspapers to keep manual typesetting alongside digital and slow automation. Nothing worked. The economics were too compelling. One person with a computer could do the work of 10 typesetters faster and cheaper. 10. Gas station attendant pumping gas. For every customer, self-serve gas stations didn't exist in Canada until the 1970s. Every gas station was full service. Attendants pumped your gas, checked your oil, cleaned your windshield, and checked tire pressure. This was the only option. You couldn't pump your own gas even if you wanted to. Gas station attendants made $50 to $70 per week in the 1960s. It wasn't great money, but it was steady work with no education requirements. Teenagers and young men worked as attendants, and some made careers of it, eventually managing stations. Every neighborhood had multiple gas stations, employing multiple attendants per shift. Self-serve gas stations destroyed most of these jobs. The first self-serve stations opened in Canada in the early 1970s. By 1980, self-serve was dominant. By 1990, finding full-service stations was difficult. Thousands of attendant jobs disappeared because customers could pump gas themselves. But here's what's interesting. It's still illegal to pump your own gas in some jurisdictions. But in most of Canada, full service became a premium option that few customers want. The attendant jobs didn't disappear because of technology. They disappeared because consumers preferred doing it themselves when it saved money. 11. Bank teller calculating everything by hand. Before computers, bank tellers calculated balances, processed transactions, and maintained ledgers entirely by hand. They used adding machines and wrote in physical ledgers. Every transaction required manual calculation and recording. Banks employed huge numbers of tellers because every customer interaction required a person. Major Canadian banks employed thousands of tellers in the 1960s. A large bank branch might have 15 to 20 tellers working simultaneously during business hours. They made $60 to $80 per week, which was decent for women because banking was one of the better-paying female-dominated professions. ATMs and computers eliminated 70% of teller positions. The first ATM in Canada was installed in 1969. By 1985, basic transactions that required tellers could be done by customers at machines. By 2000, online banking reduced the need for tellers even further. The tellers who remain handle complex transactions, but the basic deposit and withdrawal jobs are gone. But here's the scale. Royal Bank employed over 30,000 people in Canada in 1970, many as tellers. By 2020, they employed about 80,000 people total, despite being a much larger bank serving many more customers. Automation didn't eliminate banking jobs entirely, but it eliminated the need for armies of tellers doing manual calculations. 12. Streetcar conductor collecting fares on every route. When Canadian cities had extensive streetcar networks in the 1950s and 60s, every streetcar had a conductor who collected fares, gave change, issued transfers, and managed passengers. The driver operated the streetcar. The conductor handled everything else. This was a unionized transit job with benefits and pensions. Toronto Transit Commission employed over 1,000 conductors in 1960. They made $75 to $90 per week, which was solid middle-class income. It was year-round work with job security through the union. Men made entire careers as streetcar conductors. Exact fare systems and later electronic payment eliminated conductors. When transit agencies switched to exact fare drop boxes in the 1970s, conductors became unnecessary. Electronic payment in the 2000s further reduced the need for fare collection personnel. The conductor position was eliminated entirely. Single-operator streetcars and buses replaced the two-person system. Here's what the unions couldn't stop. The conductors were protected by strong transit unions, but automation was too efficient. One operator could run a streetcar alone with automated fare collection. The unions negotiated severance and early retirement packages, but the jobs still disappeared. 13. Lamplighter maintaining gas street lamps. Some Canadian cities still had gas-powered street lamps into the 1960s that required daily lighting and maintenance. Lamplighters walked routes every evening, turning on lamps with long poles, and returned every morning to extinguish them. It was low-skill work, but somebody had to do it. Cities like Montreal and Quebec City employed lamplighters into the early 1960s. They made $50 to $60 per week, walking routes regardless of weather. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady employment for men without education. Electric street lights eliminated the job completely. As cities converted to electric lighting through the 1950s and 60s, lamplighters were phased out. Electric lights turned on automatically at dusk and off at dawn. No human labor required. The last lamplighters in major Canadian cities worked in the mid-1960s. The job that existed for over 100 years disappeared in one decade. Log driver guiding timber down rivers before truck transportation became cheap and roads reached remote areas. Canadian lumber companies moved logs by floating them down rivers. Log drivers walked on floating logs using poles to guide timber downstream, breaking up jams and ensuring logs reached mills. This was incredibly dangerous work in freezing water. Log drivers made $100 to $120 per week in the 1950s and 60s. The high pay reflected extreme danger. Men died every season from drowning or being crushed by logs. But it was necessary work because there was no other way to transport massive quantities of timber from remote forests to mills. Truck transportation and roads into remote areas eliminated log driving. By the 1970s, logging companies built roads into forests and trucked logs directly to mills. Log driving disappeared, not because of automation, but because better infrastructure made it obsolete. The last commercial log drive in Canada happened in Quebec in 1991, but the profession was essentially dead by 1975. Log driving was a defining Canadian occupation, romanticized in folk songs and culture. The men of the deeps were celebrated workers. Then trucks made the entire profession unnecessary, and it vanished. Cultural importance doesn't protect jobs from economic reality. Factory floor supervisor, using only paper and clipboards before computers and digital systems. Manufacturing plants employed supervisors whose entire job was walking the floor with clipboards, recording production numbers, tracking inventory, and managing schedules using only paper forms. Manufacturing supervisors made $400 to $500 per week in the 1970s. This was middle management salary for coordinating production without any computer assistance. Everything was clipboards, paper forms, and manual calculation. A supervisor needed organizational skills and the ability to do math quickly, but no formal education beyond high school. Enterprise resource planning software and digital inventory systems eliminated most floor supervisor positions. When factories computerized in the 1980s and 90s, one person with a computer could track what previously required 5 people with clipboards. But here's what changed. The remaining supervisors need computer skills and data analysis capabilities that didn't exist in the clipboard era. The guys who made careers as floor supervisors in the 1970s couldn't transition when their factories computerized. They were too old to retrain for digital systems. Many took early retirement because their specific skill set, paper-based production management, became worthless overnight. Why these jobs aren't coming back? Here's the pattern across all 15 occupations. They required human labor for tasks that either technology automated or that became unnecessary when society changed. Icemen disappeared because refrigerators replaced ice. Elevator operators disappeared because automatic elevators worked better. Telegraph operators disappeared because phones were faster. The jobs weren't downsized. They were eliminated completely. These weren't bad jobs. They paid middle-class wages. They supported families. Men and women built entire careers in these professions with pensions and dignity. Your grandfather might have worked one of these jobs for 30 years and retired comfortably. You can't do that now because the job doesn't exist anymore. The workers weren't replaced with better jobs. When 12,000 telephone operators lost their jobs to direct dialing, they didn't all find equivalent employment. When thousands of railway brakemen were laid off, they didn't transition into similar paying work. Many never recovered professionally. They spent the rest of their careers in lower paying jobs or retired early. Technology and economic change eliminated these occupations faster than the workers could adapt. That's the brutal reality of job obsolescence. Your skills become worthless through no fault of your own. The career you trained for ceases to exist. and you're 45 years old starting over. These 15 Canadian jobs aren't coming back. The infrastructure that required them is gone. The technology that replaced them is permanent. And the next generation of job eliminations is already beginning with AI and automation coming for white-collar work, the same way machines came for these blue-collar jobs decades ago.